they're really quite a diverse group. So you have some people there who bluntly are definitely on the nationalist wing, who have been in Ukraine since 2014. You have some people who are often mixed roots, both Ukrainian and Russian, including a Russian citizen who refuses to now speak Russian, and that are there simply because they're outraged by what happened. It's not really a political decision. There are others who, and this surprised me most, actually, there are some Navalny supporters and very liberal Russians who I would normally expect to see in a trendy cafe, but fair play. You know, they've been fighting for Ukraine on the front.
And what have you understood about their motivation?
Their motivation is eventually to overthrow Putin. And they think that that can only be done in an armed way, and they think that that needs to happen so that Russia can cleanse itself, I suppose, of this catastrophe that it's inflicted on Ukraine, this terrible thing it has done.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are catching up with Dr Jade McGlynn, a research fellow from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She's the author of 2 in-depth books on Russia, Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia, and Russia's War. And she joins us now from the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. Jade, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Kyiv has been a hive of activity this week, with visits from the US Defence Secretary and the German Defence Minister, all coinciding with anniversaries of the Orange and the Maidan revolutions. What is life like there at the moment?
Life here actually is quite normal. I arrived here from Kharkiv, from East Ukraine, and it always strikes me whenever I come from East Ukraine how normal life feels here. I think there is I think that the anniversary of the Euromaidan, of the Revolution of Dignity, and also of the Orange Revolution have helped to shore up that sense of defiance. But to be honest with you, that sense of defiance is here anyway, because really people don't have any other choice. The snow has arrived as well, which is always nice when the snow first arrives.
And as you say, you've just returned from the Kharkiv region in the northeast of Ukraine, where large areas were captured and occupied by Russia at the start of the full-scale invasion. Those areas have been mostly retaken now. Can you just give us a summary of how intensely the war has been fought in that area and how it's been affected?
Mm-hmm. The war is still being very intensely fought in that area. During my time in Kharkiv, I spoke to soldiers who had just come back from the Kupiansk front, where the Russians are currently carrying out another, I think the third assault on the small city since autumn, or since the end of summer anyway. They were back, unfortunately, to mark their friend's funeral. In terms of what's going on there, they all feel very confident that the Russians will not take Kupiansk, but they just wonder how many Ukrainian lives will have to be sacrificed in order to keep it. And I think there is this sense in general, particularly in Kharkiv, of, I think betrayal is too strong a word, but a sense of exasperation at perhaps why Ukraine's allies do still appear not to quite understand the essence of this war, and still to assume that Vladimir Putin is a man who is either looking for negotiations or an appropriate person to have negotiations with, i.e. that he can be trusted. Of course, that's on the more slightly military and political level than ordinary citizen, though I think they would have pretty similar views if you asked them as well.
And when you say there was a sense of exasperation about allies not understanding the situation in Ukraine, what was it exactly? Is it about that talk about negotiations with President Putin? What is it exactly fundamentally, do you think, that's being missed?
Mm-hmm. When I come here, or particularly when I go to Kharkiv, it's like going into a different world. And for me, I actually find it psychologically nice, because sometimes when I'm not so much in the UK, but certainly in the West more broadly, I find it hard because the conversations that one is having around Ukraine and Russia, it feels like talking about whether or not you've ironed your bed sheets when your house is on fire. It's not that having ironed bed sheets aren't nice, of course they are, they're just perhaps not the most relevant thing to focus on when flames are in your house. And of course, that's me as somebody who's British, who finds it very easy, to understand why people in the West might feel or think or push certain views. For Ukrainians who are living in Kharkiv all of the time, it just seems mind-boggling to them, and they don't understand why the aid has started to dry up, both humanitarian aid and, of course, military support. They don't understand. They don't really understand why they have to. They're willing to sacrifice everything. If I can, I would cite, or quote rather, one of my friends, a soldier there who defended Melitopol. He'd never been a soldier before, but he joined up in the early hours of the 24th of February, and obviously had to very swiftly evacuate from Melitopol, even though 80% of his brigade died, but thankfully he didn't. He just had frostbite. And when I was speaking to him about his views on I suppose what one might call Ukraine fatigue, and whether or not there was any sense of perhaps the defiance lessening in Kharkiv. He said, well, what difference does it make to me if the Russians come here again and they take the city this time? I'm going to die. So I can either die fighting or I can die when they shoot me. What difference does it make? And of course, part of me wants to say, oh, Vladik, that's so sad. But it's also, he's right. He's right. There wasn't any sadness. He wasn't asking, for a cuddle. He was just stating a basic fact that he, as an active member of Ukraine's armed forces and of a particularly energetic battalion, would be shot. And we went then, after this conversation, straight to a sort of a wildlife park. It's called the Feldman Echo Park, and it's a very famous one. And there, as you go in, of course, everything is pretty ruined. There are still a few zebras and bunnies. But as you go into the entrance, there's pictures, a picture of 6 different men, and they were all the volunteers who stayed behind. And then later on, we walked past the toilets for the park, and my friends who defended Kharkiv explained that those were the toilets where the 6 volunteers were taken and just shot point blank in the head when the Russians came. So how can one not really, it's not even so much about defiance, it's just a basic self-defense instinct that either way the situation is looking pretty grim. And I suppose it must be really exasperating for Ukrainians to feel like you have to perform, you have to constantly explain why your house shouldn't be bombed, why you shouldn't be shot point blank in the face in order to get support, especially when there are other reasons beyond simple sympathy for Ukrainians, but national interest and geopolitical security reasons for countries to support Ukraine.
Thanks for telling us that story. It's very very hard to listen to those facts. When you talk about people being frustrated about the lack of aid and weaponry, for example, I'm just wondering where the disconnect is. I mean, what are people saying they're not getting, and what do they need? So, for example, the soldiers that you spoke to who had been defending Kupiansk, what do they need? What are people saying?
I won't speak specifically to what those soldiers in Kupiansk need because, to be honest, they don't discuss specifically them, mainly because I probably wouldn't understand and I would be of little use to them on those particular technicalities. But more generally, I think there's 2 points. One is, I say frustration, but I definitely don't want to convey that the Ukrainians aren't incredibly grateful, because they really, really, truly are. And particularly with, I have to say, particularly with the UK, and I don't think they just say that because I'm British, they're particularly fond of Britain. But secondly, I think the disconnect is between the announcements and the actual deliveries. So if we go back to the F-16s point, which, I mean, these have been promised for an incredibly long time, and yet still they really haven't been delivered in any sort of considerable numbers. And they would have made a huge difference, and they still would make a huge difference. So I think that's the issue, is that nobody has any problems really with the words. It's just the actions that follow those words, and perhaps at what speed those actions follow the words.
And the soldiers that you spoke to who had been defending Kupiansk, can you tell me a little bit about what they told you about what they're experiencing?
They didn't tell me very, very much, to be honest, because it's very, very hard and it's happening right now. Often I think the soldiers find it easier to talk to me because I guess I'm a blank slate. I mean, I'm not talking about military kind of sensitive things, just about different activities or different things that happen, people who are taken prisoner, the guilt that they feel, etc. In terms of Kupiansk, I mean, the main thing is that they are freezing. It's very, very cold in the trenches, and that it's very hard. They don't have enough drones, bluntly. That's the biggest issue. They don't have enough drones to be able to take out the Russian artillery positions, and they don't have enough artillery because there's a clear deficit of shells on the Ukrainian side, one that's only going to get worse until next winter, or at least the end of next summer. So that's the main thing they were saying, is how much they need drones, especially because unfortunately that was also connected to the person whose funeral they were in the city attending.
And did they tell you what they're expecting over the winter, how they're going to try and get through it?
They just understand that they have to get through it, and if they don't, then they'll die trying. I mean, it's in some ways this a luxury to be able to theorize, and I think that to an extent it's a luxury that's returned to Kyiv and to other parts of the country, but it's not a luxury that's really returned to Kharkiv region. They will just fight. They will fight until they're not there anymore, until they die.
And as you say, the fighting is extremely intense at the moment in that part of Ukraine, is it?
It is intense in Kupiansk, but they're very lucky that Kupiansk is slightly high, so it's on a sort of height, so it's not as intense as say in places like Avdiivka, which is in Donetsk oblast, the neighboring oblast, where let's just say the geographical slopes are not necessarily on the Ukrainian side. I mean, I do want to stress as well, because I appreciate I'm saying some really depressing things here, but I want to not necessarily to balance it, but just to give a more accurate picture so that it's not too one-sided on my part, which is that you go into Kharkiv city and there's so much rebuilding, there's so much life, and even in the villages. For example, we went into the town. To me, it's a town. They call it a village, but it looks like a town. Of Derhachi, we had some tea with the men. We went to one of the sort of children's centres, and it was so beautifully equipped. You know, they had these beautiful flat screens, nicer than many nurseries in the UK. To be honest, the children were really engaging because the children have to study online. Then sometimes the older ones study in underground schools, like bunker schools. And then these children's centres are really important places for them to socialise, for them to have that sort of communication with other children their age, which is, of course, so important for children's development. And you were so happy the children were playing, their laughter, of course, it makes you happy. But then you come outside of this children's centre and you see that the rest of the building above ground is in complete ruins and it's completely destroyed. And it made such an impression on me because Ukrainians, they are continuing life, and they're not just continuing it in the sense of surviving. People are really thriving in conditions that, on the face of it, look very, very horrific. But Ukrainians have found a way to make it work because there's that level of resilience.
That must be quite impressive to witness that. The last time we spoke, you told us about people you had visited and spoken to in deoccupied areas, and you've done the same again. Who did you see, and what kind of insight did you get in particular? I mean, what struck you the most? Was it that resilience, or was it something else that you've learned?
Of course, the resilience and the defiance always strike you, but I think a lot of it was, for example, the rebuilding, the amount of regeneration that's going on, which even, let's say, in this summer wasn't quite at that level. And that's important because it speaks to a hope. Because I think sometimes when we talk about this war as a stalemate, you get the impression that, okay, well, then Ukraine will just lie in devastation and everything will be awful. But that's really not the case. I mean, we drove to a town called Stary Soltiv, which is very close, well, pretty close to the Russian border. And but not so close that it can be shelled. And there was so much rebuilding. The church was destroyed, but they were repainting it and destroying it. There were shops open. There was a post office open, there were people around, and my friends were explaining, I'd never been to this town before, but my friends were explaining it was completely deserted, so it gives you also a lot of hope. Ukrainians are very future focused, and they believe that they will win, in part because they don't see that they have another option. And I think the frustration is simply, please help us to hurry this up.
Yeah, and you said last time also you were interested in assessing the effect of Russian propaganda in those areas that had been occupied. What evidence have you found on how that's been used and how it's affected those communities?
So yes, I was working on a report that will come out actually in early December on this topic. So one of the most interesting things is the element to which the effects that it had are now wearing off. For a long time, there was this fear that the Russians would come back, and now there is a strong sense that people feel able to return to, commit to rebuilding their properties, or to rebuilding, properties around them. So the fear, because a lot of Russian propaganda in the occupied territories works on fear, that fear is wearing off, and that can only be a good thing. It's being replaced by some hope, which these people surely deserve. In terms of some of the other aspects about why Russia is great, why Ukraine is rubbish, that of course has also been undermined, in particular by some of the special divisions, special battalions. For example, Kraken division, which defended Ukraine, does an awful lot of work bringing humanitarian aid to people, helping elderly people, helping those who are unable to help themselves. And that, of course, in turn then undermines, Russian propaganda saying that they're all right-wing radicals, who use civilians as human shields, because they can see that they're not they have reality. That's another aspect. But in terms of the occupied territories itself, the propaganda there is accelerating. It's becoming ever more intense.
And there is a report on a post on Telegram by an advisor to the mayor of Ukrainian Melitopol that in the occupied part, Ukrainians are being urged to change their surnames to Russian names when they renew their passport and take Russian passports, changing their identities essentially. Have you heard about that tactic being used?
I have, but it's a relatively new tactic. So again, in line with what we were talking about just then, in terms of the acceleration of the cruelty of the Russification processes. Russia launched this war, the full-scale invasion, with a claim that Ukraine is not a real country, that it is Russian. Its propaganda efforts try very hard to impose that on people. Of course, lots of people in the occupied territories do not believe that, and know that is not true, and bluntly, quite violently resist it, which is why there are so many examples of different Russian occupiers being killed by the resistance that continues in these occupied territories on an almost daily basis. However, the Russian army are in charge there. They rule in a particularly brutal way, and they are enforcing not just Russian passportization, i.e. forcing people to take Russian passports, but now even forcing people to change their names. Of course, they also threaten to kidnap the children of people who refuse to take Russian passports, that they'll say, well, social services will take your children away. So I think pretty much anybody would take a Russian passport in those circumstances.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you in a little while about deportation of children to Russia. But before that, interestingly, you've also met with Russian soldiers fighting for Ukraine with the Free Russia Legion. What motivates them, and how have they managed to escape the Russian propaganda machine?
To be honest with you, they're really quite a diverse group. So you have some people there who bluntly are definitely on the nationalist wing, who have been in Ukraine since 2014. You have some people who are often mixed roots, both Ukrainian and Russian, including a Russian citizen who refuses to now speak Russian, and that are there simply because they're outraged by what happened. It's not really a political decision. There are others who, and this surprised me most, actually, there are some Navalny supporters and very liberal Russians who I would normally expect to see in a trendy cafe, but fair play. They've been fighting for Ukraine on the front. So how they get there, it really differs according to each person. They have to go through an incredible amount of checks. It normally takes about 9 months from applying to check. Sometimes they tell in advance before they join the Russian army. Then they sign up to the Russian army, and they are given, once they're approved, they are given examples of, directions of how to cross. One guy had actually crossed a minefield to get there. Others simply were already in Ukraine after 2014 and had a slightly easier journey into the Legion.
Did you speak to the person who crossed the minefield?
Yes, he's a very.
So tell me his story.
Okay, so he's a very young man. I won't give too much exact detail because obviously I wouldn't want to put him in an uncomfortable position, to put it mildly, but he was a very young man, very intense, as you might imagine, and he signed up beforehand. So he got in touch through various secret means that, bluntly, I don't actually know exactly how they do this because they're not necessarily public, but they were aware to him through a different political grouping that he was involved with, let's put it that way. And it took 7 months for him to be accepted, because there are an incredible amount of checks for this Legion, because they expect that Russian security services will be trying to infiltrate it, and of course they are all the time. Having done that, he was then advised to join up to this certain sort of division within the Russian army, as a sort of contractor. Having done that, he then arrived in the place where the Ukrainians, sort of where he would be, because the Ukrainians knew which division he was in. And then they gave him the directions to how to cross the minefield. I mean, this is how it's told to me. Of course, we have to be a little bit sort of skeptical, but it was certainly the
war stories.
Exactly. But it was certainly the most interesting story of how people got there. Other people went to Georgia and then waited there. And then from Georgia, once they had been approved, once the checks had been approved, they then came to Ukraine that way, which, to be honest, seems a more sensible way of doing it if it were up to me.
And what have you understood about their motivation?
Their motivation is eventually to overthrow Putin, and they think that can only be done in an armed way, and they think that needs to happen so that Russia can cleanse itself, I suppose, of this catastrophe that it's inflicted on Ukraine, this terrible thing that it has done.
One of the most striking and really upsetting things is the human rights abuses of the deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia. I know you've met with an NGO about this. Firstly, how many children are we talking about? Do we know how many have been taken to Russia?
The most reliable figure seems to be somewhere around slightly under 20,000. The Russians have actually spoken about, hundreds of thousands of children, but it's not quite clear why, what exactly has led them to talk about that figure. Of course, that would then speak to something, on a scale just almost too ghastly to imagine. The NGO that I speak to, they conduct a lot of research into this, so they find the exact places where the children, and not only the children, because the Russians also take people from elderly homes, disabled people, and prisoners. And of course, everybody is going to talk about children more than they will about prisoners, but prisoners are human beings, and they also shouldn't be kidnapped and, lost in the middle of Russia. So they find the exact places where they've been sent, and they also identify the individuals who are involved in this process. In terms of what happens, there's an incredible amount of pressure on the children. Again, it comes back to these ideas, this ideology really that inspires this war, which is that there is no Ukraine. And of course, with every act of Ukrainian resistance, it's proof again and again and again that there is Ukraine. And stealing the children, brainwashing them, sometimes often actually torturing them, forcing them to renounce their own identity. That is a way of Russia proving that its lies, of making its lies reality. Because if you can force these children to say, actually, they are Russian, that they're not Ukrainian, then you are essentially kidnapping the next generation of Ukrainians and making them Russian. you're making your lives real in a really horrific way. But
And how is this NGO managing to find the people who have disappeared to Russia?
to be honest, it's really not as hard as you would think, because they are so open about it on the Russian side. Because on the Russian side, they say they are saving the children. They say, "Oh, look, we are saving these children from the war, and we're saving them from Ukrainian nationalists, and all of these, all of these terrible things." So, I mean, they're really quite open about it. They've become less open about it since April, since the ICC warrant for Maria Lvova-Belova, the children's rights ombudswoman, as anomalous as that sounds. But before then, in particular, I mean, there were pretty much daily updates, and even still now on the local level, you can easily find both from the occupational authorities themselves, who are sending the children out into Russia, and the Russian regions too. So,
of course, Russia denies that this is a deportation. It says it's evacuating children to safety from the war. But I'm just wondering, the Russian families that agree to take these children in, or to even adopt them, I mean, are they convinced it's a good idea then? They're buying the whole story.
I can't obviously talk on behalf of those families, what they do believe and what they don't. But I will say that I spent a lot of time in Russia, including living there between 2014 and 2022, the full-scale invasion, but after the first invasion had been. And many, many people that I spoke to outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg truly did believe that Nazis were in control in Kyiv, and that ordinary Ukrainians were oppressed by an extreme band of crazy right-wing nut jobs. So it doesn't surprise me terribly that if many of these families probably do think that they're actually doing something good, and see that. And
there's an investigation.
I was just going to say, and then they would in turn interpret the children's kind of declaration of Ukrainian identity as, of course, brainwashing from the Ukrainian side.
There's an investigation by the BBC and saying that an ally of Putin, who denies it, is found to have adopted and changed the nationality of a 2-year-old taken from a children's home in Kherson. If it's going up to that kind of level, and that's true, it does signify that this evacuation is part of a much bigger plan, the Russification that you've alluded to.
Yes, it is. It's a plan to destroy Ukraine's identity. I think, in one word, it's a genocide. And I know that's a word that's used in different ways, but it's a very technical definition. And the stealing of children, particularly from orphanages, particularly from children's homes, which I find especially distressing, because there's nobody who can come to look for those children. They don't have a mum or a dad who's going to come and find them. They're probably lost. And the longer this
and when
goes
you say it's not,
sorry, go on.
Sorry to interrupt, but when you say it's not only children, it's disabled people and the elderly as well. It's simply going for the people who can't fight back.
Exactly, the most vulnerable people.
How successful are the efforts to recover these people?
Not very. A couple of hundred children have been reclaimed by parents who've managed to raise the money and to go into Russia itself and to show, to prove, and to reclaim the children. But we're talking about, a couple of hundred, fewer than 200 out of 20,000. There have been a couple that have been freed through a sort of weird system involving the Office of the President, the Russian side, and the Qataris. But again, that's free people, and it seems to me to be a large part of actually a PR move to try to brighten Maria Lvova-Belova's reputation, to make them seem like they're reasonable people that you can have a discussion with, when quite clearly reasonable people don't kidnap Ukrainian children en masse, send them to horrible institutes in Russia and try to brainwash them.
Just wondering, Jade, what else is on your agenda while you're there?
Mm-hmm. So actually is to go and have a nice dinner tonight and hopefully relax a little bit.
Sounds like you need one after that.
Yeah. And then tomorrow I have meetings mainly with officials, and then I'm heading off to Odessa for a few days. to have more meetings and to spend some time in the city, because I'm always in the northeast, so I thought I'd travel. But of course, Odessa is under
And
a lot of attacks at the moment. So.
you regularly visit Ukraine. What will you take away from this visit?
A true admiration of the adaptability of Ukraine's. So it's not just that Ukraine is resisting in defiance, but it's just that adaptability. They seem to have an understanding, maybe not always exactly of what is happening in the West, but that kind of instinct of, okay, fine, then we'll have to find new and more innovative ways to defend ourselves. And they started, there's lots of new products starting to come out, particularly electronic warfare to disable drones. I find that innovation, that I suppose that refusal, absolute refusal to give up. Of course, as an analyst, you have to look at what is happening, look at the numbers, that you find the information on the ground. But I think as an analyst, you also have to be a human being, and you have to recognize that sometimes some human beings are impressive.
And what do you think people who haven't been to Ukraine and experience what you have and talk to the people that you have, what do you think the West, as it were, needs to understand?
I think there's a difference between ordinary people and between politicians. So if I was to talk about ordinary people, I think that, and I'll speak mainly to British people because obviously that's where I live, I think that the British people have understood pretty well what's happening, just instinctively almost. You don't really need to explain. I think the problem is that a lot of British people feel overwhelmed. It's very hard to watch this level of suffering that's happening in Ukraine and to not just want it to stop. And if your politicians aren't offering you a clear way to make it stop, then it's completely natural that people are just going to stop watching it and stop paying attention, because they're just trying to protect themselves because it hurts them so much. And I think that's a totally normal and understandable reaction. I think the bigger issue is with the politicians, and in particular the fact that whilst a number of politicians on all sides, it's not a party political point, really get this, they understand what this war is about, that this is not a war just to get a little bit of territory, but it's a war to destroy Ukraine with a geopolitical aim of then making Russia a much more influential actor in world security and a decisive actor in European security, which I, for one, am not a big fan of as a plan. Some politicians get that, and other politicians get it, but I think they try to ignore it because it probably means that we are going to have to, we being Britain and especially other countries too, are going to have to rearm. We're probably going to have to rearrange certain things, certain assumptions we've got used to since the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's a pretty terrifying thing to have to explain to the electorate. And so they're trying to avoid it and pretend we can go back to some imagined status quo, that maybe we can negotiate with Putin, that maybe we can sort something out. And that's not an option.
Dr Jade McGlynn, it's been great speaking to you. Good luck with the rest of your trip, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.